So let's have a look at see where what I'm going to talk about today. So I'm going to take you, I think, into a very different space, into a very different world of information systems. I'm going to take you into a world of information systems where things aren't digital, where things are bits of paper sitting on shelves. Um, but those bits of paper have real relevance to people's lives, and so therefore we have a challenge of making those bits of paper available to, in the case of National Records of Scotland, to the citizenry of Scotland to improve their lives and improve their life outcomes. So what are those challenges for us in that context of people finding things, I suppose, in our collection? So I'm going to talk about a few things today. First of all, I'm going to set a little bit of public sector context, just to give you an illustration of the sorts of things that, as a public sector organisation, we have to consider. Then I'm going to say a little bit about archives in the public sector and specialise on that a little bit. Then I'm going to talk about what's in our 80 kilometres of on our 80 kilometres of shelves, and then I'm going to say a little bit about how you search an archive, and then I'm going to give some anecdotal examples, perhaps to illustrate where some of these biases come from. Talk a bit about language of description, and then finally ask some questions about what we can do. I was very impressed by Martin's idea of doing stuff. Doing stuff is, it seems to me, the thing that matters in life. So, moving swiftly, what's the public sector context? Well, in the UK, public services must be fair. And that's actually encoded in legislation. It's encoded in the Equalities Act 2010. And and that act requires that certain protected characteristics must be assessed, or rather policy changes must be assessed against their fairness in respect of certain protected characteristics. And these are those characteristics. Now, in the Scottish Government, we have a process of Equalities Act testing that is done every time a policy is changed or developed. And we have to write a long and complicated report to explain how that policy does not disadvantage persons with these characteristics, and that's as it should be, of course. But let's think a little bit about what that means for the archive and retrieval. So is our archive equally accessible for people of different ages, of different abilities? Is there any bias in respect of race or religion or belief or sex? These are difficult. These are very challenging questions for archives, and you'll see why as I go on. So this is not these are not small matters, and these are not things that we don't take very seriously. We take them very seriously, but as you'll see, the challenges we have in this space are legion and historical. So let's have a little look now at the context of public sector archives. So people have been citing stuff from the earliest citation so far, I think, was something in about the 1950s. I'm going back to 1898 just because I work in archives and it's old stuff. So the Dutch Manual of Archiving that was published in 1898 talks about what's in an archive. And it talks about the whole of written documents, drawings, printed matter, officially received or produced by an administrative body or one of its officials. Well, that sounds awfully reasonable, doesn't it? A very reasonable set of things to put in a government, in a public sector archive. A few years later, 1922, the wonderful and amazing Hilary Jenkinson, beloved of British archivists everywhere, described in his Manual of Archives Administration Uh, the archive is consisting of documents which formed part of an official transaction and were preserved for official reference. So we've got senses of officialness here. We've got senses of in the case of the Dutch manual, written things. We're using the words documents, so that's an interesting concept. But so are these introducing some sort of bias? Well, we'll see in a minute. And then we have the American archivist Schellenberg talking about values of information in archives, talking about the evidential value, um, evidence of the organization and functioning of the government body that produced them, and then informational value, information about persons, corporate bodies, things, problems, and with which the government body dealt. And these are all, each of these three things are slightly different takes on what should be or what has been in a public sector archive. Now, there's a trope that I'd ask you to think about, and that is, and it's a trope that was largely introduced by Hilary Jenkinson, and it was the concept that the archive is neutral, and indeed that the archivist, the selector of documents going into an archive, is neutral. By neutral, I think that's synonymous with fair or unbiased in the context of today's conversations. And that's something that when I started work in archives was a given, and I only started work in archives about 10, 12 years ago. So it's not that long in the tooth in the archival world, but that's now beginning to be strongly challenged, I think would be an understatement. So let's have a little look about what an archive actually is. Okay. So if we think about the 80 kilometers of shelf space that I'm responsible for making sure doesn't disappear, what's actually in that stuff? Well, this is indicative. This isn't a quantitative graph, but it is qualitatively accurate. Okay, and if we look at this pie chart, we have all the information created in Scottish society. Then we have the information that's captured in records, records being official or evidence of transactions. Then we have the information captured in the records of the Scottish Government. And then if you need to get your magnifying glasses out now, because that little line that looks like it's an artifact of the drawing is in fact the actual collection of records that we retain in the National Records of Scotland as a proportion of the information created in Scottish society. It's minuscule. It's a sliver of a selection. It's tiny. It's still 80 kilometers long, which is quite big, but in the grand scheme of things, it's absolutely minuscule. And so in what way can that sliver ever be unbiased? Can it ever be fair in any reasonable meaning? So actually, let's dig down a little bit deeper. And if we expand that tiny sliver, and we actually look at the different types of information that we hold in our 80 kilometers of shelving, this is a breakdown of that by our various different sub collections. So the first thing I draw your attention to, it's not terribly obvious in this graph, but the bottom right hand quadrant, half and a bit more. So from High Court around to Sazines on this diagram is actually court and legal documentation. Now that arises because of the way in which our archival acts are framed. The 1937 Public Records Act in Scotland focuses on the records of the legal system in Scotland and the courts of Scotland. and we're still governed by that, and it heavily influences the shape of our collection. We then see on the sort of upper left quadrant, we've got a load of various different private and business records, records of churches, records of businesses and engineering systems, rail and canal systems. Very popular rail records are, if you're ever interested. Rail records are, if you want to make money in archives, have lots of records of railways. There's lots of people that like looking up stuff about railways. And then on the top right-hand side, we have the sort of more, what one might think of as the more traditional records of a government archive, the administrative records of government departments and government administrations over time. So we're looking from 1707 up to the current day in that space. I should say we've got records across this space ranging from the 11th century right up to only a few months ago in different contexts. So we cover a vast range of times as well. Now, is this an unbiased collection? Would be a reasonable question, I think, to ask. What caused this collection to be the shape that it is? So I've indicated that it's skewed towards legal documents because of the legal framework in which we operate. The 1937 Act privileges court records and legal records. So already we're seeing influences of significant skewing and biasing against the question, against that overall question of documenting Scotland's history. Look at our tagline at the bottom: preserving the past, recording the present, informing the future. How do we inform the future accurately if what we've preserved in the past is skewed, is not representative? And that's a very challenging and open question. And when we're thinking about recording the present, when we're thinking about capturing things now, what can we do to change the nature of the collection that we create to remove some of these biases? These are difficult and interesting challenges for archives. So let's today's conversation is supposed to be about retrieval. So let's think a little bit about how an archive is searched. Well, in reality, users search an archival catalogue. The archival catalogue is digital, it's online. It didn't used to be. Only 10 years ago, well, 15 years ago, it was paper. And you came into the organisation and you leafed through a copy of the catalogue in paper form. So it's only in relatively recent times that archival catalogues have gone digital. In fact, the National Archives in Kew, I think it's probably about 20 years since their catalogue went online. They first launched ProCat in about the year 2000 as a digital catalogue. Now, the interesting things about archival catalogues is that they are human created. We're dealing with physical documents here. There isn't an automated system that can take a physical document and describe it. The only thing that is realistic to apply is the Mark I human brain. Having said that, in the National Records of Scotland, there's about 3.8 million entries in our catalogue, and they've been created over many decades. And that in itself is an interesting source of skewing and bias. That mostly consists of the archival catalogues. For people who aren't familiar with archival catalogues, this will sound strange. Archival catalogues tend not to describe the subject matter of the document, of the object. They tend to describe the context of its creation. And that's a basic philosophical difference between archives and libraries in terms of the way library type information systems, that the the cataloging is based on the context of its creation. So it's, now I'm going to get this right, it's ontological rather than epistemological. So rather than attempting to, as libraries do, to uh, pigeonhole information into a pre-coordinated structure, traditionally Dewey and Library of Congress, archival catalogues look to describe the world as it is. They look to be ontological in their nature and attempt to capture as well as they can the environment, the true environment of creation of the object, and don't therefore focus at all on, or very rarely focus on, the subject. Now, what that means is for each object there is in fact limited descriptive text. And hereby we get to an interesting problem, because the document representatives in the old information retrieval models of the 1970s and 80s is actually very weak in archival catalogues. The actual document is sitting on the shelves. It might be a medieval charter or some court records from the 1700s, a case of the infamous case of Burke and Hare, say the trial papers of said individuals. What does that look like on the catalogue? Well, it might just consist of a name and some case, so the date of the case and the charge that the person was charged with. And yet, of course, historians would be fascinated by such documents for their core content. Now, the other thing that's important to understand about archival catalogues is there's an economics game being played here. We don't have infinite numbers of archivists available to us. And so the material might be described by box, by paper, by file, or even by document. There are different granularities. And archival cataloging says it should use the terms in the document, i.e. the language of the day. But of course, that's filtered by the experience and vocabulary of the cataloger at the time of cataloging. So that becomes also introduces some interesting features. So some anecdotal examples. Let's imagine users searching for documents in Scotland's role in the trade of enslaved persons. Well, perhaps they might be found in the 18th and 19th century papers of Lord Muckety of Muck. Unfortunately, enslaved persons aren't mentioned, because enslaved persons is our language for this group of people, not the language used of the day. I won't utter some of the terms that were used in the day of the language, because they are so now so pejorative and unacceptable that I can't even use them in public. However, there might be a property inventory inside these papers describing a Jamaican plantation and compensation after abolition that was paid to Lord Muckety of Muck or his ancestors. It might be mentioned in the accounts, and there might be lots of information there, but it wouldn't be described in the catalogue in respect of enslaved persons. So how would our user find this? What about the infamous Anne Macduff, an invented person, obviously, in 1750? Well, she's not mentioned in any documents, but the wife of John Macduff is mentioned, because in 1750 women were not described by in their own right. They were the chattel of their husband. Okay, but moving even to more modern times, think of the events that took place in Brixton and Toxteth in the latter half of the latter quarter of the 20th century. Were they an uprising or were they a riot? Different groups describe those events in each of those ways, and indeed the word riot is seen as a microaggression by some of those groups. So we have to think very carefully about this. So let's look at the language of description that is in our catalogue. So if we think about the fact that 1 in 4 adults in Scotland experience challenges due to their lack of literacy skills, let's ask ourselves a question: what's the reading age of descriptions? Well, in some of our records, they're described as Byzantine. Well, that very concept of a Byzantine structure requires a level of education and a level of literacy that is actually extremely exclusive and is not utilitarian at all. We also need to think about linguistic time travel. In medical terminology, dropsy of the dropsy of the 19th century is in fact edema due to congestive heart failure. But even in researching this today and getting the example, I discovered that edema is spelt differently by America and the UK. So how do we account for that? Thinking about an institution that is literally just down the road from me, Her Majesty's Young Offenders Institute at Polmont, that might be described as a borstal, an approved school, or a youth detention centre in records through the latter half of the 20th century. How do we account for that? So what can we do? Well, of course, nothing can be done if the record did not survive. I know it's a slightly obvious statement, I'm going to make it anyway. There is a model of archival selection, which is called the leaky barn model. You place your documents in a leaky barn and you wait for the water to come in, and the ones that don't rot are the ones you keep. Surprisingly, that's a rather accurate description of archives in the early periods. Scotland infamously lost a lot of records because of a leaky ship. It sank in the North Sea. And there's a long and complicated set of stories around that in fact relate to the founding of the National Records of Scotland in effect. Cataloguing is going to be manual for the foreseeable future. We're talking about 80 kilometers of paper documents. They're not going to get digitized, and even if they were, turning those handwritten documents into digital document representatives that could be indexed is extremely challenging. Archival standards help, but not a lot. That's because humans are not neutral, unfortunately. We just aren't. There's nothing we can do about it. And as a consequence, archives are not neutral, despite what people like to think. So I think we can take some learning from Martin's talk, actually, about transparency. If we can understand the biases, perhaps we can try to compensate. So I think there's something about archives declaring their biases and declaring the process that built the archive, so that users of the archive can understand what's going on, and can compensate. They can then understand the results that the archive gives. If you think of the archive as an information system as a whole, then that concept of transparency that Martin, I think, was talking about so eloquently, I think is a really powerful concept to help us compensate for some of these things. But my closing question to the technical people here and the people who think about this problem in digital terms is, can your technology help? Thank you.
Thank you, Tim, for this very interesting talk. So we have a few minutes left for questions for the panels, but I would like to start. So I'd like to start like with a general question to everyone, but maybe you want to go first with the answer. So you said that the way the information was stored in the archive reflects a lot on the political system back then, and this is like a thing that I was wondering about. For all of our speakers, is how does the data, well, the archive in particular, but data in general, reflect systems of power in like these
Absolutely.
days, back in the days, and how does this affect the data today? And how do you see, Tim, like personally, the connection to biased data that has been influenced by systems of power outside of the archive?
I think that's exactly the point. The archive, that is precisely it. The archive is a reflection of is a reflection of the systems of power, and it always will be. And there's enormous movements now within the archival community to address those ideas of power imbalance and how they reflect into the archive. So particularly, I'd point people, if they're interested, to the work of Michelle Caswell in America, who's looking at these power imbalances and how we can try to compensate for them. And interestingly enough, reflecting back again on Martin's talk, one of Michelle's principal approaches to addressing those issues of power is for the archive and for archivists to declare their own biases and their own experiences, so that users of archives can understand that situation and try to compensate.
Okay, thank you. Then my next question would go to Martin. There is also another question in the chat for you that says many of the features in our models are hard to be explained to end users. How do we provide an explanation if the user has no idea about the meaning of what the feature is? And concerned with that as well, I would like to add, if you see any, because you were mentioning a relationship between explainability and fairness, and I wanted to know if you see any tension between these two, because well, let's say it like that, I actually do see quite some tension between explainable AI and fair solutions for AI. And I wanted to know if you see any relationship to that, what David Carmel was asking, and if you have like other situations where you think that explainability could actually harm fairness.
Yeah, thanks, Mike, and also David for the question. Yeah, so there's a couple of dimensions to this. One is it's useful to make distinction between interpretability and explainability, and so this interpretability could mean that that somehow maps a complex phenomenon, complex feature to something less complex, and then there's a question of conveying that less complex item to an end user. It could be someone in technology, could be someone outside technology. So what you see in the literature now is that distinction being made. For many of us, complex features can be explained in terms of, oh, well, there's a mixture of TF-IDF and document length normalization, and then we're good with that, even if it's a highly complex feature. So that's the interpretability step with the explainability step that works for us. For other types of stakeholders and for their use cases, that second step translated so that it's appropriate for their use case will require something else, right? We can't wait until everyone has had basic IR1 and IR2 in primary school. No, we need to somehow make this explainable in such a way that it enlightens people and where appropriate, even empowers people to take action. Is there a tension? Of course, as with the first question, there are always power plays at stake. Those with knowledge, those without knowledge, those with direct means to do interventions, those without, and in those, in some cases, making stuff or continuing to make stuff complex or less accessible can be part of a power game.
Great, thank you. Maybe for everyone to reflect on this, like I keep wondering how we can, like we as researchers can avoid things like algorithmic solutionism and this like fixing tech with tech narrative. So maybe that's something you might want to discuss in the coffee break. But there is another question for Leif, which is also the last question for this session. It comes from Yashar and says, in recommender systems, the concept of opportunity is studied with respect to benefits of both items and users, like different stakeholders. If we would like to use the concept introduced here, like recommendability of items for access, does that mean we are giving equal opportunity to users as well, and how to study this concept for both items and users?
Yeah, it's a good question, Yasha, right? Because like intrinsically, we're saying, I think Martin pointed this out already. It's like it's a three party problem, right? You have your users who want to get benefit, you have the vendors who want to sell their items, like or their particular movies or products, and then you have the platform itself that wants to make money. And so there's this sort of three ways optimization going on. And so when we think about it from and then this is where you start thinking about fairness from the different perspectives, right? Like the vendors might go, well, I want equal opportunity or equal access to my market. However, the platform itself is going, well, we want to maximize our revenue. And that may not necessarily being fair to all items, right? Because you want to recommend the items that maximize your profit. And then the users, well, if I'm fairer and give you more options to access, right, that might lead to these great surprises, right, but not necessarily a very good experience because I'm either paying for content I don't like or you're just wasting my time. So it's kind of very, very tricky balance between all three. But invariably, we can start to say, well, if my system is recommending these items, then is that matching up with how profitable those items are? What I certainly don't want to do, if I'm, say, the platform, is recommend items that I'm not making money from, right? That just doesn't make any good economic sense, right? And so this is obviously where you have this tension between sort of, what's the right thing to do, supporting more artists across the world to do certain things, or making more revenue for us internally.
Thank you. I guess I'll hand over to Graham then.
Graham, you're mute.
Thank you for pointing that out. Sorry. Thanks everyone for really, really great talks. It's been a wonderful session and really interesting. I think we've got some time for some extra discussions just now. So as a sort of general point, I've got an interesting question for Tim. So maybe I'll put that first and then we'll have a wee quick discussion first. So Tim, are there concrete approaches at the moment that explicitly try to find relevant yet not archived sources from underrepresented groups from past decades that were overlooked or deliberately left out because of past politics?
There are movements in that direction. Unfortunately, I think it would be fair to say they don't have a lot of traction at the moment. In terms of the public sector archive, that's we have our boundaries which are governed by our public task and our remit, and our funding is commensurate with that. It tends not to fund us on what some people would say, and wrongly in my view, fishing expeditions to go and get older stuff. In reality, what happens is that communities deal with this themselves. So we find that across Scotland, in fact across the UK, there are a large number of community archives that take in and begin to preserve this previously unselected material. There are notable examples in Scotland, particularly in the islands, in the Western Isles, where Gaelic or Gaelic, I always get that wrong, is a principal language. There's an awful lot of work done in these places by volunteers to create local community archives that have phenomenal relevance to those local communities, and which a national and public archive simply can't approach. So we also find that with other communities, the LGBT plus community is also, there are notable examples of that. So yes, there are, but they tend not to be driven by, unfortunately, they're less driven by public money.
Great, thanks. And I should point out that was Ting that actually asked that question. As a general sort of discussion, Martin raised a lot of really sort of interesting principles at the start of his talk, which sort of sets the scene for the whole sort of discussion topics that we're thinking about. So I was just wondering, so what would you say are the most important things that we need to do to try and sort of maybe convince practitioners to implement these principles, particularly when there's multiple stakeholders and everyone with different views? So I wondered if you all just had other thoughts on it, and maybe if you had questions for each other about any of the things that have actually been raised in each other's talks.
So can I ask Martin a question then?
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, I really liked, well, thank you for presenting the different principles and explaining them to me. And what sort of came out of that was that I was thinking about the accuracy principle. And you said that, you know, the principles say that AI systems should be accurate. And I was thinking about that a little bit more, in particular with respect to search engines. Do we consider a search engine to be accurate? So, and this kind of goes over to what, you know, Tim's been working on. You know, he's putting together all these collections, but, you know, obviously the source information is you know, there is not a representative sample, and, you know, the archives are meant to be like, you know, the archivists are meant to be non-biased and all that type of thing, right? And they're an kind of intelligence all of their own, sort of putting all this information together. And then we have search engines, which were largely thought about initially as trying to be presenting this unbiased view of, you know, delivering relevant and useful information to people, right? And so, should search engines, are they AI, or are they like, you know, just a, you know, are they just a person to direct, or a system to direct you to different things? And do they fall under the same categories as these principles that you're putting forward? I kind of wonder this because, like, the same principles you put forward could be equally applied to Tim, because he's doing this, and like he's an intelligence. He's got real intelligence. That's great, and he's making all these decisions. But surely he should be trying to. He's probably going through and making these things accurate, reliable, resourceful, right?
By the way, Lee, that was what I was struck with also by Martin's talk, that everything that Martin was talking about, as far as I perceived, did not only apply to AI. It was actually some very generic principles about information systems.
Absolutely. I think, you know, we are, you know, at the forefront of holding ourselves accountable for the systems that we're developing, yet the rest of the, you know, many other fields are not. Right, you know, so, you know, I was just thinking the same thing. If by asking, you know, so first of all, I was thinking, well, in the example I showed about the two different pages, one is clearly inaccurate information, right? So if the search engine's returning a page that's inaccurate or is misinformation, then it loses out on the first principle of accuracy, right? But if it's not considered AI, then is that okay, right? So that's kind of one example we might want to think about.
Yeah, so I'm not sure the question whether it's AI or not is that interesting. Sorry, Leif, but I think that the question, do people interact with this? Is this exposed to people, to groups of people, and do they become, could they potentially be harmed by this? And whether it's a moped or a kite or a search engine, I don't care. But if it affects people, then you have to ask those questions and consider those.
Absolutely.
Exactly.
So I'm not saying my question was super interesting. I'm just trying to make a point that you know, we're saying this for AI, but we should be saying this for everything.
Sure.
Like for every sort of decision making, right? And I because like because clearly what I would do then is just go, well, you know, under the GDPR regulations and new things that come on, it says if AI is involved in the process, well, I just remove AI, right? And then I don't have to uphold these principles, correct? Right, and that's just not appropriate. They should be across any type of human decision making that involves people, right?
Agreed. It is what triggered this is, and then we get back to some degree to the power question that came up a few times, is that
Yes.
at different sections of society, people in all walks of life feel less, they have less control, and especially around sort of data-driven systems that seem to be able to take somewhat autonomous decisions. That feeling, that attitude is felt very strongly. So that's why I think we've seen over the last 5 to 10 years this very strong movement to establish principles, and not. Of course, we had discussions when databases came up, but those were different discussions. Those were discussions about, what are you storing about me? Not so much about this somewhat autonomous device is affecting me. No, I think that's an addition of the last couple of years. That concern, that societal concern, that's being first of all expressed and then studied systematically and operationalized to some degree.
I notice we have a hand up. Is it Ting Su?
Yes, you can ask your question.
Hi, sorry. So I was just thinking about what Life has said about the cancer research one. I think one of the problem with that, also related to fairness is that we should have freedom of speech. So even though the information is clearly wrong, I totally agree. I don't think that should affect their retrievability. However, in order to protect people's health, as what Martin said, I think maybe we should have a balance between freedom of speech and the accuracy of the information. So can we actually make it retrievable, but also have a warning up there that is actually that is actually like accessible across all the platforms, for example, the Chrome or Firefox, like this. So I wonder if there's a balance between freedom of speech, because pretty much all information is type of speech. So is there a balance between freedom of speech and the accuracy? Is that considered also as fairness, or is that considered another type of problem?
Yeah, that's a really good point, Tim. Right. So, on one hand, it's like that, and that's why I'm sort of saying, should we make everything equally accessible and available, right? Like, who are we, like in Tim's position, who's here to decide that this item is more important than that item, right? Should we be taking this very, all information is, should be equally accessible kind of route, or which, there are cases for and against that. I mean, and actually what was interesting when I was trying to find that example is that over the last 5-6 years, Google and Bing and so forth have done an amazing job at cleaning up the content that comes back in response to these medical queries, right? Largely driven by some of the earlier work by that Ryan was doing, that pointed this out, and so on. And so I actually had to go down to, like, I don't know, page like 200 or 300 to find the example of misinformation. So ironically, me trying to search for misinformation was very hard to find it. Right. And so that, so that did make for a very good example. But it's definitely this trade-off, right? And that's where I think, like, when we go to more transparency, maybe it's more actually empowering users to be able to specify their needs in a much richer way, right? So, that's obviously one way to overcome the bias. Like, I'm looking for things that are, true and accurate, or I'm looking for conspiracy theories, or however you like to phrase it within your query, to allow you to access different parts that you wouldn't necessarily otherwise be shown, right? I think Tim wants to follow up.
Yes. So my take on this is so freedom of speech is a human right, okay? So, but human rights are not not all human rights are equal. There's a categorization of human rights. Some are qualified, some are less qualified. The right to life is unqualified. The right to privacy is highly qualified. And I think we can use that concept to help us make judgments in this space in a, I won't say a neutral way, but in a more balanced way. Because you're quite right, Leif. Who is it who is it who's the archivist who says that this should be preserved and this should not? What value frameworks are being used? And that's my point about transparency. But I think we have got some frameworks that we can look to help us to think about those balances. I mean, I would be worried about warnings. We operate in a liberal democracy. Imagine that technology that is being described being deployed in a less benign environment. I think we need to be. I think it's very dangerous for us to come up with these solutions that to problems that occur in our liberal environment, and think about them being projected into less liberal environments, and what that would mean. And so I think there's a whole load of things here. It's a very, very interesting space.